Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Sunday, March 2nd, 2025, and you're listening to Alex's News. The weather in Riverside today will be mild with a high of 60.0 degrees and a low of 53.3 degrees, so you might want to keep a light jacket handy if you're heading out. Coming up on today's show, we'll examine the significance of the USS Carl Vinson's arrival in South Korean waters and what this naval deployment means for regional tensions. We'll also analyze how Trump's executive order mandating English-only communications could fundamentally transform federal government services. Plus, we'll explore the impact of a private company's lunar lander on the competitive landscape of space exploration and how it's changing the dynamics of the modern space race. Stay with us for these stories and more on Alex's News. We begin with breaking news from the Korean Peninsula, where a major U.S. military asset has arrived amid rising tensions with North Korea. The USS Carl Vinson aircraft carrier has docked in South Korea just days after North Korea conducted missile tests. For more on this developing situation, we're joined by our international correspondent, Ethan. Ethan, tell us about this significant military deployment.
Grace, according to ABC News, the USS Carl Vinson, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, arrived in Busan, South Korea today, March 2nd. This port city is located about 200 miles southeast of Seoul. What makes this deployment particularly noteworthy is that it's the first time a U.S. aircraft carrier has visited South Korea since June of last year, and it's the first such deployment since President Trump returned to the White House in January.
And the timing of this arrival seems particularly significant, coming just after North Korea conducted missile tests. What can you tell us about those tests?
That's right, Grace. As reported by South China Morning Post, North Korea test-fired strategic cruise missiles just 3 days ago, on February 28th. Pyongyang described these tests as a demonstration of their counterattack capability and readiness of nuclear operations. According to Perplexity, this marks North Korea's 4th missile testing event this year alone, continuing a pattern we've seen in recent years, where they conducted 64 tests in 2022 and 30 tests in 2023.
That's quite concerning. Has Kim Jong-un made any statements about these recent missile launches?
He has. And they're troubling. ABC News reports that following these recent missile launches, Kim Jong-un has ordered his military to be fully prepared to use its nuclear weapons. This directive has significantly escalated tensions in the region, which explains why the U.S. is responding with such a visible show of force.
Can you tell us more about the USS Carl Vinson strike group? What assets are included in this deployment?
According to WNKY News 40 television, the carrier strike group includes not just the USS Carl Vinson itself, but also the USS Princeton and USS Sterett. South Korea's Navy has emphasized that this deployment is intended to demonstrate the strong U.S.-South Korean military alliance and enhance the interoperability of their combined military assets in direct response to the ongoing threats from North Korea.
How is North Korea expected to respond to this U.S. carrier deployment?
Multiple sources, including ABC News and South China Morning Post, indicate that North Korea is likely to be angered by the USS Carl Vinson's deployment. They typically view such U.S. military assets as major security threats. Historically, North Korea has responded to similar deployments with additional missile tests or other military demonstrations. However, Perplexity reports that as of today, there have been no reports of new missile tests specifically in reaction to the carrier's arrival.
What about diplomatic efforts? Is there any movement on that front?
There is some diplomatic context worth noting. South China Morning Post and ABC News report that since his inauguration in January, President Trump has renewed his offer to revive diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. However, North Korea hasn't directly responded to these overtures. Instead, they're alleging that U.S.-led hostilities have actually intensified since Trump took office.
Are there any other factors influencing North Korea's behavior right now?
ABC News reports that experts believe Kim is currently focused on supporting Russia's war against Ukraine and may only consider resuming diplomacy with Trump when his cooperation with Russia declines. However, Perplexity notes there's no direct evidence linking North Korea's missile tests specifically to its cooperation with Russia in the Ukraine conflict.
And what's next for U.S.-South Korean military cooperation?
According to Perplexity, the US and South Korean militaries are set to conduct a major joint exercise called Freedom Shield later this month, which is just a few weeks away. This exercise, combined with the carrier deployment, underscores the two nations' commitment to maintaining a strong defensive posture against North Korean threats.
Thank you, Ethan, for that comprehensive report on this developing situation in the Korean Peninsula. We'll continue to follow this story as it unfolds. In our second story today, a major policy shift has just occurred at the federal level. President Donald Trump has signed an executive order making English the official language of the United States. This marks the first time in American history that such a designation has been made federally. Joining us to discuss this development is our political correspondent, Chloe. Chloe, what exactly does this executive order entail?
Grace, this is indeed a significant policy change. According to NPR, the executive order signed yesterday by President Trump not only designates English as America's official language, but also rescinds a Clinton-era policy that required federal agencies to provide assistance programs for people with limited English proficiency. Under this new directive, agencies can now voluntarily decide whether to maintain those support systems.
How is the White House explaining the reasoning behind this decision?
The administration is framing this as a unity measure. NPR reports that the White House stated the order would promote unity, cultivate a shared American culture, ensure consistency in government operations, and create a pathway to civic engagement. According to The Guardian, the executive order itself claims that making English official will reinforce shared national values and create a more cohesive society, particularly encouraging new Americans to learn and adopt the national language.
What does this mean practically for government services and people who don't speak English fluently?
That's where things get complicated, Grace. As reported by The Guardian, citing the Associated Press, the order allows government agencies and organizations receiving federal funding to decide for themselves whether to offer services and documents in languages other than English. Essentially, as Perplexity API explains, it removes legal obligations for federal agencies to provide multilingual services. This could potentially create inconsistent access to services across different federal agencies, as each now has discretion over their language policies.
Are there constitutional questions about whether a president can make such a designation through executive order?
Absolutely. Constitutional scholars are raising significant questions about this. According to Perplexity API, the U.S. Constitution doesn't explicitly grant the president authority to designate an official national language. Typically, such major policy changes would require legislative action. NBC News notes that previous attempts to establish English as the official language have been pursued through legislation, such as the English Language Unity Act introduced by former Senator J.D. Vance, suggesting congressional involvement may be necessary for such a designation to be legally binding.
How does this federal move compare to state-level language policies?
While this is unprecedented at the federal level, it's quite common at the state level. According to both NPR and The Guardian, English is already the official language in over 30 states. However, previous attempts to establish English as the official language federally have been unsuccessful until now.
What's the current linguistic landscape in America that this order will affect?
NBC News reports that while English is the most widely used language, the U.S. Census Bureau indicates that residents communicate in over 350 languages, with more than 3/4 of Americans speaking only English at home. Importantly, NPR notes that the number of people in the U.S. who speak languages other than English has more than tripled since 1980, showing our increasing linguistic diversity.
What kind of reaction has this executive order received?
There's been significant criticism, particularly from advocacy organizations. NPR reports that the League of United Latin American Citizens has argued the move would harm immigrant communities and those seeking assistance learning English. The Guardian notes that Hispanic advocacy groups have been especially critical, particularly after the Spanish-language version of the White House website remained offline since Trump's inauguration. House Minority Leader Representative Hakeem Jeffries has suggested the order should be examined for legality, indicating potential future legal challenges.
Thank you, Chloe, for that comprehensive breakdown of this significant policy change. We'll certainly be following any legal challenges or implementation issues as they develop. Here are some other headlines. Grammy-nominated R&B singer Angie Stone has died at age 63 following a tragic car accident on March 1st. Stone was traveling from Alabama to Atlanta after a performance in Mobile when the Sprinter van carrying her and 9 others flipped over and was struck by an 18-wheeler. While the other passengers survived, Stone suffered fatal injuries. The singer had been scheduled to perform at the CIAA Men's Championship basketball game in Baltimore. Stone rose to prominence in the late 1970s as a member of the pioneering female rap group The Sequence, before joining Vertical Hold and later launching a successful solo career with hits like Wish I Didn't Miss You and No More Rain. Beyond music, she appeared in films including The Hot Chick and Ride Along, and performed on Broadway in Chicago. The U.S. Forest Service has terminated a $75 million grant to the Arbor Day Foundation that was intended to plant trees in disadvantaged neighborhoods across America. The decision comes as part of the Trump administration's broader push against diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Communities from New Orleans' lower Ninth Ward to wildfire-affected areas in Oregon will feel the impact. In New Orleans, a local environmental group called SOU had planted over 1,600 trees and planned 900 more before funding was cut. The grant was originally part of the Biden administration's climate policies under the Inflation Reduction Act, which allocated $1.5 billion to urban forestry programs targeting areas facing environmental challenges like pollution and heat islands. Communities along the U.S.-Canada border are expressing concern about the personal and economic costs of tariffs imposed by President Trump. On February 1st, Trump signed executive orders placing a 25% tariff on most Canadian goods and 10% on energy and critical mineral imports. While implementation was delayed until March 4th, following agreements with Canada on border security and drug trafficking issues, uncertainty remains. Border residents worry about disruptions to highly integrated supply chains, increased costs for essential goods, and impacts on cross-border relationships for work and family. Canada had planned retaliatory tariffs on U.S. products, including cosmetics, appliances, and paper goods, which were also temporarily suspended. A group of migrant transgender women near Rome have been praying for Pope Francis during his hospitalization, celebrating his outreach to the transgender community. The Pope has made notable efforts to engage with transgender Catholics, including meeting with a Spanish transgender man in 2016 and more recently hosting 4 Catholic transgender women from the United States at the Vatican. These encounters, often facilitated by priest Don Andrea Canocchia, have provided a sense of belonging for transgender Catholics who frequently face exclusion within their faith communities. Despite the Vatican's official stance on gender theory, Miami Beach is maintaining its strict approach to spring break for 2025, with the mayor firmly rejecting a return to the city's previous relationship with spring breakers. Following successful crowd management measures implemented in 2024, including increased police presence, curfews, and alcohol sale restrictions, the city continues to prioritize public safety and resident quality of life over accommodating large spring break crowds. The strategy aims to reshape Miami Beach's tourism profile toward more family-oriented and upscale visitors, balancing economic interests with community well-being. We have some exciting news from space today. In a historic achievement for commercial space exploration, Firefly Aerospace's Blue Ghost lunar lander has successfully touched down on the moon. Joining us now with more details is our science correspondent, Ethan. Ethan, tell us about this remarkable landing.
Thanks, Grace. This is indeed a breakthrough moment for private space companies. According to the Associated Press, Firefly Aerospace has just become the first private company to achieve a fully successful soft landing on the moon without any complications. The 4-legged Blue Ghost lander, which is roughly the size of a compact car, touched down near an ancient volcanic feature called Mons Latrée in Mare Crisium, or the Sea of Crises, on the Earth-facing side of the moon.
That's impressive precision. How accurate was the landing?
Remarkably accurate, Grace. Sky News reports that the spacecraft demonstrated exceptional navigation capabilities by landing within a 100-meter target zone. This kind of precision is crucial for future missions, where landing location can determine mission success or failure.
I understand this mission has connections to NASA. Can you explain that relationship?
Absolutely. This mission is part of NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services Initiative, or CLPS. According to ABC News, NASA paid $101 million for the delivery service, plus an additional $44 million for the science and technology payloads on board. It's essentially NASA outsourcing lunar deliveries to private companies, which helps stimulate commercial space development while achieving scientific goals.
Speaking of science, what exactly is Blue Ghost carrying to the moon?
The lander is packed with technology, Grace. The Associated Press reports that Blue Ghost is carrying 10 scientific instruments for NASA that will conduct various experiments during its planned 2-week operational period. These include the Lunar Environment Heliospheric X-ray Imager, which observes solar wind interactions with Earth's magnetic field, and a fascinating instrument called LISTER, which is a drill that can penetrate up to 3 meters below the lunar surface to measure heat flow.
That's fascinating. Are there any particularly unique experiments on board?
Several, actually. One that caught my attention is the electrodynamic dust shield, which demonstrates dust mitigation using electric fields. This is crucial because lunar dust is incredibly abrasive and can damage equipment. There's also the next-generation lunar retroreflector, which will allow for precise measurements of the Earth-Moon distance. And Sky News notes that the lander will capture high-definition imagery during a total eclipse on March 14th and the lunar sunset on March 16th to study lunar dust behavior.
How does this mission fit into the broader context of private lunar exploration?
This is only the second time a privately funded spacecraft has achieved a soft landing on the moon. According to Sky News, it follows Intuitive Machines' Odysseus lander from last year, which successfully touched down but tipped over during landing. The track record of private lunar landing attempts has been mixed, with notable failures including SpaceIL's Beresheet in 2019 and Espace's Hakuto R Mission 1 in 2023, both of which crashed during landing attempts.
Are there more private lunar missions on the horizon?
Absolutely. The Associated Press reports that Intuitive Machines is expected to attempt another lunar landing later this week, while Japanese company Space will attempt a landing in approximately 3 months. ABC News notes that NASA aims to launch 2 private lunar landers per year as part of its commercial lunar program, acknowledging that some missions may fail. The agency sees these commercial partnerships as a way to stimulate a lunar economy and scout the moon before future astronaut missions under the Artemis program.
Thank you, Ethan, for bringing us this exciting update on private lunar exploration. It's certainly a new era for space exploration.
My pleasure, Grace. It's story 3 of 3 today, and it's certainly an exciting time to be covering space news.
That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King, with Claude Sonnet 3.7, Gemini Flash 2.0, the Perplexity API, and the Google Cloud Text-to-Speech API. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.